So we've taken a look at the inward corner, outward corner, inward curve, and now we're going to do the outward curve. You're going to need your outward curve pattern, cut one from muslin and cut one from a contrast fabric. Make sure you copy your stitching lines. This is still a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And make sure to transfer your notches, clip your notches into your fabric. So I have my contrast fabric here with my stitching line marked on the wrong side. And I have my muslin with the stitching line also marked on this side that I've determined to be the wrong side. I've got my notches, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Same thing on my contrast fabric. The notches are really there just to orient these two pieces together. Again, notches serve as registration points so that we know how to piece all these puzzle pieces together. So I'm going to take both sides, right sides together. Remember, I like to mark my fabric on the wrong side. So right sides together, matching up my notches, matching up my cut edges, and I will pin this in place. Again, pinning perpendicular to my stitching line. Okay, I'm going to head to my sewing machine and I'm just going to turn my work around so I can start here with all my excess fabric going to my left. I'll start here on a number 2 stitch, back tack, go all the way down, work my way around this curve, again around that curve, and I'll finish here back tacking at the end of my seam. Number 2 stitch, back tack at the beginning. Work my way around the curves. If you find it difficult to pivot fast enough, your fabric starts bunching up, make sure your needle is down, lift your presser foot, and pivot your fabric to get yourself oriented again on the stitching line. And back tack at the end. Trim your threads, and let's head back to the work table. So I've got my work stitched together, and just like with our outward corners, if I just turn this right side out immediately, we're going to have a lot of bulk left over in this seam allowance. And similar to what we saw on the inward curve, see if I can get a shot deep down in here. When you go looking in there, especially here where these two curves exist, the seam allowance in there is going to be rippling and buckling on itself. You can see here how it kind of meanders a whole lot, rippling and buckling on itself. So just like we did with the outward corners, we've got to reduce some bulk in the seam allowances here. I'm going to show you a few techniques for doing that. So the first thing I want to show you all is grading your seam allowances. From this side, the muslin side facing up, I'm going to zoom in here on my seam allowance, just on the edge here. We've got two seam allowances, the muslin and the contrast fabric, and they're both cut at the same spot. The raw edges are flush. When we grade our seam allowances, what we do is we take individual seam allowances and we will trim each one to a different width. So I'm going to leave my contrast fabric at the full 1/2 inch seam allowance, but my muslin, I'm going to trim this to about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I'm going to grab a pair of scissors, nice sharp scissors. You can use some tiny scissors if you feel like you need a little bit more dexterity while doing this. But what's important is that I'm only cutting my muslin seam allowance. I am not cutting the contrast fabric, so pay close attention. I'm just sliding my scissors in between the two layers. I've got this end of my scissors sitting on top of my contrast fabric, and I've got my muslin sitting in between the blades of my scissors. And I'm going to trim my muslin seam allowance to about a 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to be checking every so often to make sure I'm not catching my contrast fabric. And I'm slowly going to work my way up and around the entire seam allowance. Small snips, taking my time. Okay, so not perfect. So it's not perfect, but this is an example of a graded seam allowance. Sometimes when you're working with 2, 3, maybe even 4 layers of fabric, you'll have a lot of bulk built into this with all of your seam allowances all sitting at the same place, all flush against one another. And it's adding a lot of extra bulk right along that edge. So grading your seam allowances is a way to create kind of a stair-step pattern where one seam allowance is shorter than the others, where multiple layers of seam allowances will be shorter than each other, creating kind of a stair-step technique that will help reduce the amount of bulk as you move towards the outer edges of the seam allowance. This is one technique for doing so, keeping a 1/2 inch seam allowance on the contrast fabric and a 1/4 inch seam allowance on the muslin. But you can also see grading of seam allowances when both sides, both pieces of fabric will be trimmed to a 1/4 inch, and then the muslin might be trimmed to 1/8 inch, depending on how much bulk you need to reduce. But this technique for grading seam allowances, basically making your seam allowances progressively smaller as you get closer to the stitching line, helps reduce a lot of bulk and creates that kind of stair-step shape to your seam allowances, nice thinned out as you get closer to the cut edge. The last thing we're going to do to help reduce bulk is right here in these corners. Now, in these curved corners, these curves here, when we had the outward corner, we trimmed our seam allowance down and reduced a lot of bulk. What I'm going to do here instead is I'm going to cut my little triangles out to help reduce extra bulk in here, just like we did with the inward corner. So just to illustrate, I'll be cutting out little triangles through both layers of fabric, if my pen would write. So I'm going to go through my muslin and my contrast fabric taking care not to cut into my stitching line. I don't want to ruin all of that work that I just did. And I'm only going to concentrate these little triangles along this curve. The straight edges doesn't really matter, but right along this curve, and I'll do the same over here. I'm just going to turn my work so I can see what I'm doing a little bit better. Chopping through both layers, taking care not to cut into my stitching line, and I'll cut out these little triangles. Because once again, when we press all this, these little open triangles will come back together, reducing some of that bulk that we get in there by turning these curved seam allowances inward. Every 1/2 inch or so. Again, be careful that you're not cutting through your stitching line. And I'll do the same on this curve here. I'm just going to eyeball it. I haven't marked this side. And again, once I get past that curved area, getting near the straighter sections of my seam allowance, I'm not going to worry about trimming or clipping into that. It's really just the curves we want to take care of. So there we go. Seam allowances are graded and we've got the curves clipped. Let's head over to the iron. Now, I do highly advise you use the tailor's board to press your seams open, so get a nice clean finish. Along these straighter seam allowances, you can use this flat edge of your tailor's point or tailor's board. Press these seams open. Take your time with these. It's going to be harder to press these given that we've trimmed one of our seam allowances to 1/4 inch. And if you have access to a tailor's board like this that has multiple edges and curves, you'll probably find a curve like this, which looks pretty familiar on our sample here. So I'm going to utilize this little curve here. If you are only working with a tailor's point or tailor's clapper that only has this edge, don't worry about trying to press these curves open. Just do your best when we turn everything right side out to push this seam all the way to the folded edge of the fabric. But if you have access to a full tailor's board, please utilize it. So I'm going to place that curve right along the curve of that tailor's board and slowly work my way around, opening out these individual clipped curves. These seam allowances will take some time. Just be patient with yourself. You can usually only press about 2 or 3 of these at a time. Please be careful that you don't burn yourself. Okay, that's a little bit better. See if I can get this little section here at the top. And then I'll work on this other curve. Get all these little clipped curves, clipped seam allowances pressed open. Okay. Not perfect, but we've got something to work with. Seam allowances pressed open. It's going to give us a much cleaner finish. Let's turn this right side out. You'll find it much easier if you're able to press those seams open. You'll find it, those seam allowances open, you find it much easier to get that seam line right along that fold as you turn everything right side out. If you didn't have a tailor's board and you couldn't quite press these seams open in these curves, do your best to kind of roll the seam allowance out, push it from the inside to get it nice and clean finished. Use an awl, use any kind of pointy object to kind of push those seam allowances out. And let's press this again so everything's nice and clean. I can see my graded seam allowance under there where I've got my 1/4 inch seam allowance on there from my muslin. And let's go label this. Okay, there is our outward curve sample. I'm going to label it as such. Outward curve, outward curves, because they are 2 curves that we've stitched over. And that is our outward curve sample done. This kind of stitching can be used for any kind of curved seams, Peter Pan collars, scalloped edges, things like that.